The Gallipoli campaign, of course, is part of the Great War, and the first slide I've got on there, just to remind myself, there were something like 20 million deaths in the Great War, the First World War, between 1914 and 1918. Half of those deaths were civilians, but of course the actual calculation of the casualties depends on when you perceive the Great War to end, because as far as Turkey is concerned, and we're here tonight to look at Turkey's involvement in the First World War, it didn't end until 1922. It's very important to remember that, and therefore the casualties, that 20 million figure is probably much less than the number of deaths that occurred in the extra deaths, if you include the extra deaths that occurred in Turkey, in Russia, and other places. There was actually a second invasion of Turkey after Gallipoli by British forces after the First World War had ended on the Western Front. Not many people know about that, but it did lead to the fall of Lloyd George and the victory by somebody I'll be speaking about later on, Kemal Ataturk. So where was Gallipoli? Well, there it is. And somebody reminded me on, excuse me, somebody reminded me last week that the Dardanelles, the Straits, one of the most fought over pieces of water in the world. And of course, not quite fought over, but significant in the current war between Russia and the Ukraine. And there we have, of course, the Dardanelles. We'll be talking about those. There's the Gallipoli Peninsula, as I said, only a very, very small strip of land, 40th of the size of Wales. And there you have Turkey. And in those days, Turkey was part of a much larger Ottoman Empire, which had been around for a long, long time, going back to the fall of Constantinople, and even before that in the 15th and 14th centuries. Now, those countries, Turkey played a very significant part in the First World War, of course, but these countries were, we'll come back to this, Romania, Bulgaria were the props, and that word was used at the time, that were going to be knocked away and lead to Germany's defeat in the First World War. I think possibly that was unlikely ever to happen, but I'll come back to that. Turkey entered the war on the 31st of October 1915. So a latecomer, sorry, 1914, a latecomer to the First World War. One of the reasons was that Britain stole 2 of the battleships, which didn't go down very well, but it's much more complicated than that. So a little larger map there. You have, it's only 6.5 kilometers wide and 7 kilometers long, that peninsula there. And one German general said that never had he known so many nations pour so many soldiers into such a small area to die. And I'll come back to that as well with some numbers which bear that out. Actually, the attack, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on, the attack on the Gallipoli Peninsula, or the Dardanelles, wasn't the first attempt, first plan, rather, for an amphibious attack on or a landing as well on Turkey. Whoops, sorry. They did plan to land here and cut Turkey off from Syria down below, but that didn't actually happen. The French people blame Churchill, this man, for the Dardanelles campaign, but the original idea, I believe, was the French, and came from the French, rather. It was picked up by Churchill, who was at that time First Lord of the Admiralty. But in talking about his decision, it's important to remember that the Tsar of Russia in January 1915 had already appealed for help for the Allies to force the straits, open the straits up to send help to Russia, and to also German ships had the two German ships, the Goeben and the Breslau, which had joined Turkey, went into the Black Sea and bombarded Odessa on the Russian coastline. So the Russians did play a part in the planning. So the first object. At the end, we can perhaps talk about other objects. I've picked 13. We can talk about other objects that could have made the cut, so to speak. So the first one, a Turkish belt buckle. Now, the Allies had a low opinion of the Turkish army. It was actually a large army, 3 million, very different backgrounds, ranging from Turks to Arabs and so on. And they obviously, the Turkish belt buckle we have here shows an Islamic symbol. And religion was an issue in the war. When I did an assembly in a primary school and showed this a few months ago, it was a much more watered down talk than you're getting. You're not getting the primary school version. A lad put his hand up and said, "Did Britain attack Turkey because they were Muslim?" And I thought that was a very good answer from the middle of an urban primary school. They didn't. Britain would have been delighted if Turkey had come in on the Allied side. It's just for a range of reasons, which we don't have time to go into tonight. They did, in fact, join the Central Powers. The Sultan, Mehmed V, did declare a jihad in November 1914, the month after they joined the war. And that did cause some angst in the British Empire. And at one time, and I'll come back to it, Britain stopped 2 battalions of Muslim soldiers from going to Gallipoli because they felt wrongly that their sympathies might be more with the Turks because of the jihad. I don't think that certainly wasn't the case. I didn't, in researching for this talk, I didn't realize that the declaration of war by Turkey on the side of Germany wasn't universally popular, and there were anti-German riots in Constantinople. But the Turks were a determined and well-organized enemy. The British and other Allied troops, the leaders, had a low opinion of them to start with, because the Ottoman Empire had suffered many defeats, many defeats going back over the last century or two, particularly at the hands of Europeans. But they had reformed, and there were a group of people who were taking over the government called Young Turks. You might have heard that phrase. They'd been done pretty well in a war against Italy in Libya, and then fought all in a number of different nations in the Balkan Wars. The Second Balkan War, they did very well. And many of the generals and senior officers who appeared at Gallipoli had fought either in Libya or in the Balkan Wars. So they had experience of modern warfare. The Balkan Wars and the war in Libya were very modern wars. Considerable German influence over the army, reforming the army. You may have all heard of Liman van Sanders. He was one of the Germans who helped to reform the Turkish army, and he was in charge of the commander of the Fifth Army, although he didn't play a big part in Gallipoli. He was commander of the Fifth Army, which was the army that had the Turkish army that was in Gallipoli just at the right time, or the wrong time from our point of view. And they were ready. they were ready. And I'll go back with one of the other objects and talk about the naval attack on the Dardanelles. But after the naval attack had failed in March 18th, 1915, they had about a month to prepare. Liman van Sanders himself said they had 4 good weeks to prepare. And if you're at our annual conference, and you can still get the recording on our YouTube channel, there was a brilliant talk by a historian called Michael Forrest on the defence of the Dardanelles, and the amount of artillery the Turks had up and down the Dardanelles was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, and certainly would have taken some doing for a number of battleships to have suppressed those batteries along the coast. So, object 2, a sea mine. As Michael Forrest revealed, the Turks had heavily mined the straits, as well as having a phenomenal amount of artillery down on the European side or the Asiatic side. The border between Europe and Asia officially goes down the middle of Dardanelles. They'd also mined the straits as well. And there's one of the blighters, not in the Dardanelles, I'm sure, possibly in the Atlantic that photo comes from. But the Turks also, and again, the Allies underestimated them, and very cleverly sowed the mines, for example, in a line where they expected the Allied battleships to turn. So a number of them ran into them. And suffered the casualties. The Allies had got minesweepers, a mixture of Royal Naval ships and trawlers. And one of the U3A members, I don't think she's here tonight, but is descendant of a whole trawlerman who was there sweeping mines. But they couldn't sweep the mines effectively because of the fire from the shore batteries. So that combination of shore batteries and floating mines was really very, very provided an insurmountable barrier for the Allies, the naval attack. And one question I ask at times, is there any campaign in modern times or even before that where a side has won just by naval action alone? And that's what Churchill expected to happen. They'd sail down the straits, they'd bombard Constantinople, and the Turks, who he thought lacked moral fibre, would surrender. They actually sent 18 battleships. A lot is made of being obsolete. They weren't obsolete. They were a little bit older, but they just weren't able to. They just weren't. Excuse me a moment. They weren't obsolete, but they just weren't up to the standards that they felt were needed to fight the German high seas fleet. But there's 18 battleships, a huge force. But this combination of mines and artillery fire did for them. The French ship Bouvet hit a mine, 70 and sank. 75, only 75 of the 718 crew survived. The French, I'll come back to the French. The French were there, as well as the other allies, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, of course, and other nations represented. HMS Irresistible and Inflexible both hit mines. Irresistible sank. HMS Ocean, sent to rescue Inflexible, also hit a mine and sank. So these very expensive battleships were being sunk by relatively cheap but very, very dangerous mines. There was rumours that the Turks were running out of ammunition. That was put about by Admiral Keyes, who was very big in the Zeebrugge raid later on in the war, but they weren't running out of ammunition. They just eased off a little bit. And an example of fake news that this man did exist, and a very brave man, Sayed Ali Kabuk, and he did actually carry these shells to 276 kilogram, incredible feat, which were then hurled at the Allies. But the fake news was that he fired the shot that sank the Ocean, but it's quite likely that the Ocean was hit by a mine. But that's not taken away from the great victory of the Turks. 18 battleships tried to sail up the Dardanelles. They defeated them. And that's recognised every year as Martyrs' Day in Turkey. So, object 3, attestation papers. Anybody who's done any research on the First World War will be familiar with attestation papers, and an abiding memory of World War I is of volunteering, soldiers volunteering. And Kitchener's call made in the start of the war, and Kitchener was one of the few people who thought the war wouldn't be over by Christmas. He called for 100,000 men. In Britain alone, Britain and Ireland rather, there were 2.7 million volunteers. In Ireland, and you mustn't forget the Irish input into the campaign. I'll be coming back to that a little bit later on. 130,000, both Catholic and Protestant volunteers in 1914-15, many of whom ended up in Gallipoli. And that's a very, very familiar picture. And I wonder how many of those actually survived the war unscathed. Now, all but 2 of the British Army divisions who went there were made up of volunteers. Not so much volunteers. There were volunteers who formed service battalions. I'm never quite sure the difference between a PALS battalion and a service battalion, but service battalions were made up of volunteers who volunteered for overseas service. But a lot of the divisions were territorial. They had actually, the territorials in Britain were formed, and Ireland had formed in 1908, and many of the divisions were made up of territorial battalions. But most of the British Irish soldiers fighting in Gallipoli were volunteers. It's only the 29th Division was a regular division, and also the Royal Naval Division. They were impressed, really, servicemen, sailors who not quite volunteers, but all the rest were volunteers, either who joined up after Kitchener's call or had service with the territorials. And that was something made of unfairly by the generals, saying that there was lack of experience amongst these soldiers. Well, there was lack of experience, of course, but lack of experience resulted in helped contribute to the failure of the campaign. And of course, all over the empire, Gallipoli is known as an Anzac event, and in Australia, 400,000 men enlisted out of a population less than 5 million. And the first Australian infantry force was raised from scratch. The New Zealanders also volunteered, and interestingly, they had their plan. The suggestion of the New Zealand government for an expeditionary force was turned down at first by the British. I'm not quite sure why that was. So, object 4 in the assembly goes down. Excuse me. Goes down well because I bring a sun helmet along with me, but I didn't think I'd put it on tonight. It'd perhaps be too much of a shock to you. So most of those volunteers, of course, thought they were going to fight the Germans. they didn't know about this new enemy that they were sent to fight. Soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, East Lancashire, where our regional conference is, from Essex and so on, ended up fighting the Turks in an area that you did need a sun helmet. The temperatures. There's one thing I was just checking what was the average temperature in Gallipoli in the summertime, and the website I looked at used the word, it gets the temperature ranges from perfect to unpleasant. It can be as high as 40 degrees C, but it can be freezing cold, as we'll see in the winter. Britain, of course, the British Army used to fighting in these conditions. The 29th Division consisted of battalions that were quite used to fighting in very, very hot climates. I do like this picture because this is obviously Australian volunteers going via Egypt to Gallipoli, forming part of what was called the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. But firstly, how did they get that kangaroo there? No, it clearly is Egypt. And what happened to the kangaroo? That'll be a great interest to many of us. So these troops from, as I say, places such as East Lancashire ended up seemingly in some very, very exotic places. But then, of course, you had the serious stuff. And I believe, do contradict me at the end when we have the questions, that's a photograph of one of the battalions of the Manchester Regiment after the first landings, but going to the Gallipoli Peninsula. And it's a daunting prospect, of course, landing on an enemy coast. These troops were probably not the first wave, but and some people in defence of the Gallipoli campaign, and I find it difficult to accept this, say that it was one of the first landings that Britain ever carried out under enemy fire, but that's not the case. They landed in 1759 rather, 1801, 1759 in Canada, in Quebec, 1801 in Alexandria, 1854 they landed in the Crimea against the Russians. So amphibious landings were not at all unusual for the British Army or the Royal Navy. Object 5, a map. This always causes a lot of excitement amongst school children because down at the bottom, the person who drew this map has got Chocolate Hill, and they say, "Oh, what happened at Chocolate Hill? What's Chocolate Hill like?" Well, it was a pretty unpleasant place to be in 1915. And I show this as the 5th object because British intelligence was really very, very poor. They only had a really sketchy idea of what the Dardanelles were like. And there's talk of, because there were landings later on, I'll show you the landing sites shortly, there were landings later on at Suvla Bay, and one person recounts that he opened a map that he'd been given. It was a map of Norfolk, not at all the Dardanelles. The problem with all of these landings, some of them were hotly disputed, but some of them weren't. And the common problem with the British attempt, or the Allied attempt rather, was that they didn't push in, they didn't push on rather. They didn't seize the initiative where they were unopposed. At Suvla, many of the volunteers, I mentioned the volunteers, many of the volunteers, they only received orders a day or so before they landed at Suvla. And of course, whether you have a good map or not, the Gallipoli Peninsula, very, very difficult countryside. One Irish author, I was doing some research with talk on the Irish and Gallipoli, one Irish author described it not a series of natural fortresses, but one giant natural fortress of different severity. That's not, of course, Hellas, which is relatively flat, and I'll point these places out on a map. But the Allies were often attacking uphill through very, very difficult countryside. Units often got lost, mixed up, and suffered heavy casualties, but then found perhaps later on a lot of them missing, returning. And you might have heard about the Sandringham Company of the Norfolk Regiment. They're supposed to have disappeared in its entirety. That was not the case, and it certainly was known at the time that a number of them, a considerable number of them, came back after getting lost and separated from their unit, and so on. But a feature, certainly of the British Army, very many poor leaders. The commander-in-chief was Sir Ian Hamilton. He'd had a very good Boer War, done quite well in the Boer War, but quite an efficient officer. But his problem, the problem with Hamilton, was he didn't exert his authority on the others. He allowed them not, as I mentioned, they didn't push on often enough, and he allowed that to happen. So many of the officers, I have to chuckle when I say this, it's just many of the officers were old, they're considerably younger than me, but many of them had been brought out of retirement. Sir Frederick Stopford had actually got himself a nice little number in charge of the Tower of London when he suddenly whisked off to fight to lead a force in Gallipoli. And Sir Almir Hunter Weston, Hunter Bunter, who is, I believe, that man there, is generally described, he was in charge of the 29th Division, generally described one of the poorest generals of the First World War. Went on to perform a lot better on the Western Front. But the problem with all of these generals was they were unused to modern warfare. And one author I've read said they just ended up resorting to a bayonet charge. They really weren't that familiar with, didn't have the skills to deal with trench warfare and so on. Some of the generals fell on their own sword, so to speak. A number were killed, actually, in the campaign. But Egerton of the 52nd Division left in a huff. Seems strange, a general leaving in a huff in the middle of a war. But his replacement, General Lawrence, actually was very, very competent. And by the end of the campaign, the 52nd Division had really adjusted very, very well to modern warfare. So some of the generals who came later were a lot better and younger, much younger than me, say. Okay. So Object 6. Now, when it was, they had a project in Ireland, a history of Ireland in 100 objects. This was the only item for the First World War. The project was from the Royal Irish Academy, the National Museum of Ireland, and the Irish Times. They only chose one object for the First World War, and this is it. It is, of course, the signal lamp on HMS Her Majesty's Transport Clyde, which we'll have a look in a moment. Gallipoli, very important to Ireland, and unfortunately, for various reasons, the contribution of their troops wasn't recognised after the First World War. But Croke Park, which is the centre of hurling in Ireland, actually had a hill called Hill 60, where Irish troops fought in Gallipoli, but the name was changed for political reasons. Fair enough, it's their country. Changed to Hill 16 because of the Easter Rising. So it's only really recently, when I say recently, over the last sort of 30, 40 years, that the contribution of Irish troops has been recognised by the government, might be recognised by all sorts of individuals. And on the River Clyde, you had the Royal Munster Fusiliers, who were decimated, and in the landing, you also had the Royal Dublin Fusiliers there. And for those of you not familiar with the places I'm talking about, this is Hellis down here, the 5 beaches. This is a flatter part of Gallipoli down below. The Anzacs landed here, the place, just to remind us, called Anzac. And then there was a second landing in August in Suvla Bay here, the idea being to come across behind the Turks and defeat them in that way. So a good plan. You had the HMT River Clyde, a Trojan horse on the V Beach. But unfortunately, if you've seen the pretty grim first bits of Saving Private Ryan, it was very similar to that. The Turks were waiting for them, and they were decimated as they came down those wooden gangplanks onto the lighters and onto the beach. And there is a very real picture. I think Stephen Chambers, our historian, has the original of that. But you see there, Allied soldiers, British and Irish soldiers, sheltering along the beach there. The Turks up here firing down on them. You see this lighter, the troops desperately seeking cover there, and wounded and dead troops the other side there. We had, of course, on Y Beach, you had on one of the other beaches 6 VCs before breakfast. That's what's called Lancashire Landing, and it's a bit of a misnomer. Yes, sorry, it was. Let me just get my beaches correct, otherwise we will be criticised. Well, somebody can remind me of W Beach. There we are. How can I forget? I had the mental block there. So 6 VCs before breakfast, before Christmas. Sorry about that. But the Lancashire Landing, 6 men of the Lancashire Fusiliers were awarded afterwards the Victoria Cross. If you were present for a very, very good talk on the VCs of Gallipoli by historian Stephen Snelling. You can find that on YouTube, our YouTube channel. They actually did it by a very complicated ballot, but a bit of a misnomer. 6 VCs before breakfast doesn't take away at all from the incredible bravery there, but no British soldier ever goes into battle without having a breakfast. So the generals did learn, because when they landed at Suvla a few months later, they actually had armoured landing craft, and the troops got in relatively unscathed, but then didn't press on, didn't seize the initiative, didn't take the hills around the beach. Object 7, a pocket watch. And belonged to Mustafa Kemal, one of the great Turkish heroes, rightly at Gallipoli. He was a divisional commander at Gallipoli. He was one of the new breed of officers. He'd been involved in the campaign in Libya and in the Balkan Wars. Many of you will know he then went on to become president of the new Turkey in 1923. And he had a huge impact on the country, made it a secular country, introduced a new language, introduced rights for women and so on, and died in 1934. probably from cirrhosis of the liver, as he used to drink about 1.5 litres of raki a day, which is quite interesting. And there's a picture of him. He was commanded the 19th Division, part of the 5th Army. I've mentioned Lyman von Sanders, the 5th Army. He was there right at a crucial point to contain the landing, and sent out the 57th Infantry Regiment with the phrase, "I do not order you to fight, I order you to die." Sorry, that's my phone going off for some reason. But he's rightly remembered in Turkey, and very importantly, was one legacy was his reconciliation, very generous to allowing visitors in as early as the 1920s, particularly as I said, that Britain was involved with the Greeks in the Turkish Civil War, the Turkish War of Independence, rather. It wasn't a Turkish Civil War, Turkish War of Independence. So it was very, very generous of him to allow British and other visitors. And you'll be familiar with this object, a Gurkha knife. The Gurkhas from Nepal have served with the British Army since the time of Waterloo, and 26 Victoria Crosses were awarded to soldiers from Gurkha regiments during the First World War, staggering amounts. And a very fierce bunch there. The first 6 Gurkhas were amongst the first to land. They attempted to capture Saribär, which is a huge feature. Talk about a natural fortress. They didn't capture it, but captured a piece of rock, which is known as Gurkha Bluff, and they form part of the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade, along with other Gurkha regiments and a regiment of Sikhs. As I said, the two Muslim regiments, the 69th and 89th Punjabis, I'm not sure whether they made it to Gallipoli and withdrawn, or they were just stopped from going there, because Punjabi, they were actually Muslims. There were 15,000, 15,000 Indian soldiers in the First World War. About 5,000 suffered from casualties. There was a small number of Indian soldiers actually in Gallipoli. That figure I just mentioned refers to the number that served for Britain. The Indian soldiers were generally much older than the Australians. For example, a lot of the average age of the Australians and many of the British volunteers, they were very young. So to meet these professional Indian soldiers, they found them very, very impressive. And there's a recurring story that the Anzacs really liked the food, chapatis and dal, because they were fed up with bully beef that was melting in the temperature in the tin and came out as a liquid, rather unpleasant liquid. And you had soldiers from all over the world. These are French African soldiers. 80,000 French fought at Gallipoli, suffering 27,000 casualties. 18% of them, 18% of the French troops featuring in the in the Corps Expeditionnaire d'Orient, who landed at Kumkale, were colonial troops. These were Muslim black African soldiers, and they served very well on the right-hand side of Helles. Object 9, a trench periscope, and many of you will know that it resulted both on all of the fronts I've shown you. The Suvla front, the Anzac front, the Helles front ended up as trench deadlock. Very, very similar to the Western Front. Snipers, a real issue. I'm not so familiar with Allied snipers, but Turkish snipers inflicted terrible casualties on the Allied army, particularly officers. Many officers were killed by snipers. And there were rumours that they were hiding in carcasses of meat and all sorts of things. There are even rumours, but Stephen Chambers says it's not the case, that there were women snipers, although I have read an account from one of the U3A people sent in, their relative actually said they saw some female snipers. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. And there it is, these trenches. But you see, very, very cramped, very, very cramped, often on hillsides, very steep hillsides. And generally now on the Western Front, we understand that the rotation system meant that Allied soldiers on the Western Front didn't spend that long in the trenches. In the front line trenches, often in reserve trenches or back even further. But there was no back even further at Gallipoli. You were always under Turkish watch, Turkish gunfire, artillery fire, and sniper fire, as I said. Conditions, particularly in the heat, in the height of the summer, very, very poor. A lot of the casualties suffered by Britain and Australia, New Zealand, and the others were to do with illness, to do with dysentery. And there, just like back in Europe, the crossing of no man's land under heavy enemy fire. This, Stephen Chambers tells me, is a fake photo. It's actually on one of the Greek islands, but it does sum up what they had to do. And a key feature of the Gallipoli campaign was the lack of artillery preparation. We get used to the idea of very heavy artillery preparation for assaulting trenches on the Western Front later on in the war, of course, but often very, very ineffective, sporadic artillery bombardment of the Turkish trenches. And so, as I've said before, these limited generals just resorted to the bayonet charge. Very, very high casualties. And there's one very sad example of a Scottish battalion. I tried to find out from my notes from a previous talk which one it was, who managed to capture 2 trenches. They went ordered to attack a third, and it wasn't there. It was on the map, and it hadn't been dug, and they're out in the open, and they were decimated. So a lot of mistakes made in difficult circumstances. And there's a real photo. This happened with depressing frequency in the Gallipoli campaign, and I think it's Krithia in the distance. When I say troops failed to press on from Y Beach, I got my beaches a little mixed up when I was talking about that, but troops from Y Beach actually made it to Krithia, to the edges of Krithia on the first day, on April the 25th, but then were withdrawn, and the whole lot were taken off the beach, and the Allies spent the rest of the campaign trying to capture this village, Krithia. 4 battles at Krithia, very heavy casualties, and no result, no victory. And another very depressing picture. We shouldn't forget, of course, that the Turks were hurled into, they were fighting for their own country, but they were hurled into counterattack time after time, and they suffered very badly, very serious casualties attacking the Allied trenches. And of course, dysentery doesn't respect nations. Many of the Turkish casualties were due to illness as well. And one of the reasons for the illnesses were the shortage of water. Dysentery is a waterborne disease, but there's no natural water in Gallipoli. There's a few, the Allies managed to dig a few wells and find some pretty grim water, but they had to ship in their water, and that, of course, was a very enormous logistical problem, much easier for the Turks because they were bringing it down from other parts of Turkey a little bit easier logistically than bringing it across the sea. And one of my favourite photos, an Australian soldier there, Australian or New Zealand soldier, giving a wounded Turk a drink of that very, very scarce water. And the gist, most people would say that the Gallipoli campaign, many historians would say the Gallipoli campaign was not supported enough. It may have been successful. I personally have doubted, but it may have been successful if they'd have put more resources into it. Very, very short of artillery. I'll mention that again in a moment, but short of all sorts of things. And of course, soldiers from both sides, they came up with all sorts of ingenious ways to make up for this shortage. The sort of things that were finding their way on into the trenches on the Western Front, grenades, proper grenades, Mills bombs made here in Birmingham, trench mortars, light machine guns. It was too early, really, for those in Gallipoli, but also they just didn't have enough of anything, really. And they as soldiers do, came up with ingenious ways of filling up jam tins with cordite and making explosives, making grenades. And they lit, they had very basic fuses lit with a match, which is okay if you are a chain smoker. Now, when I do this in assembly, a school assembly, I say, don't go home and say to your parents that this man came in and told us it was okay to smoke. I'm not, but it's probably one of the only times it's an advantage to smoke when you've got grenades, plum jam tin grenades. You have to light them, light the fuses. So this is Victoria. Name is gone completely, but he spent 41 hours defending the trench at Krithia, near Krithia, using these plum jam tins. His second lieutenant in Walsall, I think his name was, second lieutenant in the 9th Manchesters, and he won that VC. He was awarded that VC August the 12th to 13th, when he spent most of 2 days hurling these plum jam tins at the enemy. He survived and sadly suffered a heart attack when he was cutting a hedge, which has always made me think I shouldn't actually do any gardening. It's a very dangerous occupation. But the main thing was there were not enough of these. A number of divisions actually left their artillery behind, partly because it was too difficult to transport these pieces to the Dardanelles, partly because it was so cramped, so crowded, but also there was this feeling that the Turks would just run away anyway. You wouldn't need these sort of things. And as I've said before, you often got very, very, very poor artillery bombardments. And object 12, a first aid kit, absolutely essential. And of course, you have, there was one, I've told, or I've read rather, one formal truce where the Allies and the Turks stopped fighting to collect the wounded, but there were many informal short-term truces to gather the wounded. And you see, if you look very, very carefully, you can see Turkish soldiers make out their uniform, and Allied soldiers, you can see them there collecting in the wounded. The hospitals, were very, very basic. You see this one actually hewn into the, this is an Anzac, hewn into the side of the rock as well. So, and eventually managed to get to safety. It took a couple of days, only a couple of days. I think is actually really quite miraculous to get them from the beach to hospitals in Alexandria. A number of hospitals in between, on Lemnos, for example, but it took quite a time to get the casualties out of range of the Turks, either by shell fire or sniper fire. And the last of the objects, the 13 objects, a wooden cross. Obviously, many of the dead were left behind and were buried on, the vast majority were buried in the Dardanelles themselves, marked with simple wooden crosses. Some of these survived, and you can actually see pictures of pilgrims, pilgrims, if we use that term, going to the Dardanelles in the 1920s and Gallipoli in the 1920s and seeing these crosses. But a large number of them were burnt. And they were burnt by Allied soldiers because the winter of 1915, 1916 was terrible. Great storms, a lot of blizzards and so on, storms that were so bad that they washed the trenches, literally washed the trenches away and all the occupants with them. And also many of the soldiers died from exposure. A number of soldiers, exaggerate it, but a number of soldiers died from exposure on sentry duty. The conditions were so bad. And there's a picture, 55. I'm not sure, is that 55 of our comrades are buried there? Not sure. Can't read the rest of it there. But of course, you've got the Commonwealth war graves there, and the Turks are absolutely brilliant at maintaining them. If you go to Turkey, see these beautiful maintained cemeteries, and there you see a Turkish wheelbarrow, emphasising how well they're looked after. Of course, the graves are lying sort of flat, not entirely flat, because of the problems with earthquakes, and that's the reason why I believe they're like that. And many beautiful cemeteries. There's 47 cemeteries altogether in the Dardanelles. Some individual memorials. There are 50. Of course, we mustn't forget our adversaries who are so welcoming to us now, and they won, of course. The Allies lost. They evacuated in January 1916, and there's over 50 Turkish cemeteries in the area, and many memorials to Turks as well. You have the message, of course, from Ataturk inviting relatives of the Allied forces, Allied soldiers who died, invited them back. There's some discussion whether he actually wrote it himself, but it doesn't matter. He was the leader of Turkey at the time, and he began this process which enabled us now to visit this beautiful part of the world. And of course, you have, amongst the really beautiful monuments, you have the Hellas Memorial with 20,855 names that have no known grave. And it's important to remember the reconciliation. There's a beautiful statue of a Turkish soldier there carrying an Australian wounded or New Zealand wounded soldier. And it's so brilliant, I think. It's not to overestimate it, that the Turks are doing such a good job. I know there are issues with hotels being built and new roads and so on, but so done such a fantastic job maintaining the battlefield and in welcoming tourists, visitors, etc. Such as this. This is, and there's Stephen Chambers in all his glory, the GA historian. We supported a group of students from a school in Portsmouth, Gosport rather than Portsmouth, to visit the battlefields just before lockdown. A fantastic experience. So I did mention, and I'm coming to an end, and I did mention the U3A project. 80 people, over 80 people responded to my letter asking for any details that they had, and some brilliant stuff. And this is really just a tiny drop in the ocean. And if I don't mention, the fact that I don't mention something doesn't mean it isn't brilliant either. Maureen Hessian, her great grandfather, fought at Gallipoli and has this actual photograph. Some of the stuff I was sent copies of, I never have originals, it's only electronic copies, because if you know me, I'd lose them. But this is the B Company, the Wigan Company, the 1st 5th Manchester Regiment, taking 2 hours before the battle on the 4th of June 1915. So they posed one last time before the battle began. A lady called Brenda Lilly sent me details of her relative, Sergeant Frederick Holcroft, at the 1st 7th Manchesters. There he is in Egypt, having his photograph taken on a camel. He sadly died with the 1st 7th Manchesters on the 4th of June 1915. Got a lot of stuff regarding the Manchester Regiment, still a huge amount of goodwill there. One person, Jim Gibb, his grandfather after the war was Sir Ian Hamilton's driver, and there he is, Sir Ian Hamilton, and he gave him a signed picture, and Jim Gibb has still got it. Unfortunately, Sir Ian Hamilton doesn't have a good reputation, and he spent an enormous amount of time trying to influence the decision of the Royal Commission so that he was exonerated and that others were blamed. But fairly, the Royal Commission ended up saying, well, it wasn't going to work because not enough resources were sent in support of this campaign. Leslie Dunlop, and her grandfather was with the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, landed on X Beach on the 25th of April 1915, shot on that day. And this photo shows him in convalescent in Malta, and he's in the middle back. And note they all have a good cigarette, a good puff on a cigarette in those days. Malcolm Woods, I think, is here tonight, sent me a lot of stuff on his relative, Bombardier James Wood, 5th Battery of Royal Field Artillery. So there were some artillery there. I don't think I ever said there was none, there's just not enough of it. He was killed in action on the 12th of July, 1915. Carol Sherwood, and this is the last one, I think Carol is here. Grandad served in the Royal Navy, and it was a bit of a mystery how he was wounded on the 27th of December 1915 when he was not on a ship. But you see there, it's got the naval division. So he would have been a reservist, a young reservist, who would have been called up and fought in the Royal Naval Division on land. That was Churchill's idea.